Notary closed her folder and said very quietly that there was a problem. Not a small problem, not a clerical error, a problem that meant my daughter-in-law had just signed away rights to something she never actually owned. My son looked at her, she looked at the notary, and nobody in that room said a word for like a full minute. I had been waiting for that moment for 2 years. I hadn't planned it that way. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of man who schemes. I spent 38 years working as a land surveyor in northern Ontario, driving out to sites at 5 in the morning, eating sandwiches in my truck, coming home to my wife with muddy boots and the thermos that never quite got clean. I'm not a complicated person, but I learned late in life that you don't have to be complicated to protect what matters. Let me go back to the beginning. My wife passed in the spring of 2019. Lung cancer, though she'd never smoked a day in her life. We had 41 years together, Frances and I. We met at a folk festival in Thunder Bay when I was 24 and she was 22, and she laughed at something I said. I can't even remember what, and I thought, that's the one. I was right. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the family, who kept a garden that neighbors would slow down to look at from the road, who could tell when something was wrong before you'd said a single word. When she got sick, I took early retirement. When she died, I wasn't sure what I was for anymore. My son Ian was 36 at the time. He'd been with his partner Simone for about 4 years. They had gotten engaged the previous autumn. I liked Simone well enough at first. She was sharp, organized, the kind of person who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Ian seemed happy. That was enough for me. We had a family property, 42 acres outside of Sudbury, with a small lake and a cabin my father had built in the late 60s. My father had left it to me. Frances and I had kept it up for decades. Every August we'd spent 2 weeks there. Ian had grown up swimming in that lake, catching perch off the dock, sitting by a fire that smelled like cedar and pine sap. That property was not just land to me. It was a record of everything our family had been. About 6 months after Frances died, Ian mentioned that he and Simone were thinking about the future, about where they'd settle long term. They were living in a rented apartment in Sudbury, and Simone, he said, had always loved the idea of having a property outside the city. He asked carefully whether I'd ever thought about what would happen to the cabin. I told him I hadn't decided anything yet. He nodded and didn't push. That was Ian. He had his mother's patience. But Simone pushed. Not at night, she wasn't there, but over the following months, in small ways. A comment at dinner about how it was a shame to let a property sit empty most of the year. A mention of a friend who'd sold a cottage and regretted it. A question, posed very casually at Christmas, about whether I'd had the land assessed recently. Each comment on its own was nothing. Together they added up to something. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. Frances would have known what to do. I just felt tired. In January of 2021, Ian and Simone got married. Small ceremony. Just family and close friends, because of the restrictions at the time. I stood beside my son and thought about how proud Frances would have been. Simone's family was there. Her mother, her 2 sisters, her uncle who told the same joke 3 times. Perfectly nice people. At the reception, Simone's mother pulled me aside. She was a warm woman, genuinely warm, and she said she hoped Ian and I had a good relationship because family was everything. I said yes, of course. She said Simone talked about the property up north a lot, that it sounded beautiful. I smiled and said it was. I drove home that night and sat in my kitchen for a long time. Something had shifted. I couldn't name it exactly. It was the way Simone's mother had brought it up. Not as curiosity, but as information. Like she already knew the shape of a conversation that hadn't happened yet. The following spring, Ian came to me alone. He sat at my kitchen table and he said, "Dad, I want to be honest with you. Simone and I have been talking, and we'd like to know if you'd consider transferring the property to us. Not selling, transferring." He said they'd take over the maintenance costs, the taxes, everything. He said I could use it whenever I wanted. He said it made practical sense financially because of what might happen with the state taxes down the road. He meant well, I know that. Ian has never had a greedy bone in him. He was repeating something he'd been told to say, and he believed it was true. I told him I needed time to think. He said, of course, take all the time you need. I took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, I called my old friend, a retired lawyer named Douglas. Not a family lawyer, a property lawyer, who I'd known since we were in our 30s and used to play hockey together on Thursday nights. I told him what Ian had proposed. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Ray, don't do anything yet. Let me ask you a few things first. He asked about my retirement income, my pension, my CBP, my savings. He asked whether I had a will and what it said. He asked whether I understood what transferring property to a child during your lifetime meant in Ontario in terms of future tax implications and eligibility for certain provincial benefits. He asked whether Simon's name would be on the transfer and what would happen to the property if their marriage broke down. I hadn't thought about any of that. Douglas said, I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm telling you to understand what you're doing before you do it. Over the next 2 months, Douglas and I talked through the whole picture. I also met with a financial advisor, my first time ever doing that at 68 years old, which tells you something about how I'd lived my life. What I learned surprised me, not because anything shady was happening, but because I'd been about to make an irreversible decision based on my son's good intentions and his wife's quiet pressure without understanding the consequences for myself. The cabin property, if transferred, would be assessed at fair market value for tax purposes at the moment of transfer. That value had gone up considerably since my father's day. There would be capital gains implications. More importantly, if something happened between Ian and Simone, if they separated, Simone could have a legitimate claim to half the property value as matrimonial property. The place my father built with his own hands could end up half owned by someone I'd known for 5 years. I also learned something about myself during those conversations. I wasn't ready to let go. Francis and I had planned to be buried on that land. We talked about it. Not formally. We'd never gotten as far as actually arranging anything. But we talked about it, sitting on the dock in the evening, watching the light change over the water. I wasn't ready to hand that away. I called Ian and told him I'd thought it over, and my answer was no. Not no forever, but no for now. I told him the property would be his in time, through my will. But I wasn't prepared to transfer it during my lifetime. I said it as plainly and as kindly as I could. Ian said he understood. I think he meant it. Simone did not understand. She didn't say so directly, not to me. But things changed after that. The calls became less frequent. When I came to visit, she was pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they're performing pleasantness. She'd excuse herself early. She had things to do. Ian would walk me to my truck afterward, and sometimes he'd look like he wanted to say something, and then he wouldn't. Where are you watching from? And has there been someone in your life who changed the temperature of a room without ever raising their voice? Leave a comment. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. By the fall of that year, I was seeing Ian about once a month. We'd have lunch, just the two of us, usually at a diner near his work. He was the same. Ian, he'd always been funny, thoughtful, interested in how I was doing. But he never talked about Simone, and I never asked. We had built a small careful space between us where certain things didn't live. In January of 2022, Ian told me they were expecting a baby. I was genuinely happy. The happiness surprised me a little because I hadn't known how much I'd wanted it. A grandchild. Something new. I told him that. He smiled the way he used to smile as a kid, unguarded and wide, and for a moment he was 9 years old again and we were fishing off the dock in August. Simone called me that evening to share the news, and she was warm. Really warm, and I thought maybe everything was going to be okay. Maybe the property thing would just become a thing that had happened, that nobody needed to revisit. The baby, a girl, was born in late August. They named her June, after Francis's mother. When Ian told me her name over the phone, I had to put the phone down for a minute. I went and stood in Francis's garden. I still kept it, not as well as she did, but I kept it. And I looked at the late summer flowers and thought, all right, Francis. All right. I drove to Sudbury the following week. I held June for almost an hour. She slept through most of it. Simone sat across from me, and she was different, softer, more open. New parents often are. The baby changes the arithmetic. Things were genuinely better for a while. I visited every few weeks. I helped with small things around their apartment. I fixed a leaking faucet, replaced some weather stripping on their back door. I was useful, and being useful helped me. In the spring of 2020, Simone raised the property again. She did it differently this time. She didn't go through Ian. She invited me for dinner one evening when Ian was working late. He'd taken a second role at his company and was putting in long hours, and she made a nice meal, and we talked about June, And then she said, I've been thinking about what we discussed before, about the cabin. I said, I haven't changed my position. She nodded slowly. She said she understood that, but things were different now. They had a child. Space was tight. She'd been talking to a real estate lawyer, a friend of her sister's, and there were ways to structure a transfer that would protect my interests. I could retain a life interest in the property. It would still be mine to use. It would just be in their names for the purposes of estate planning. I listened to all of it. She'd done her homework. I said I would think about it. I did not think about it. I called Douglas the next morning. Douglas was not surprised. He told me what a life interest arrangement actually looked like in practice, the limits of what I could do with the property, the complications if I ever needed to access its value, the fact that it still meant Simone's name on title during my lifetime. He also said, Ray, this is the second time. You said no once. If she's coming back a second time, that tells you something about how important this is to her. That's not a judgment. It's just information. It was information. I also called my daughter that week. I should have mentioned her earlier. Her name is Ruth, and she lives in Halifax with her husband and their 2 kids. Ruth is 51, practical, plain-spoken, and she can read a situation faster than anyone I know. She's got her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and I mean both of those as compliments. I told Ruth what was happening. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. When I finished, she said, Dad, you need to talk to a different lawyer, not Douglas. He's property, he's good, but an estate lawyer. Someone who can look at your whole picture and help you set things up so this question never comes up again. She was right. Ruth is usually right. Over the following 3 months, I worked with an estate lawyer in Sudbury, a woman named Margaret who had been practicing for 27 years and who did not waste words. She reviewed my will. She helped me establish a trust that would hold the cabin property, with Ruth and Ian as co-trustees and June as the ultimate beneficiary. She explained that this structure meant the property could not be sold or transferred without both trustees agreeing, and that it would pass to June without going through probate, and that it was protected from any matrimonial property claim in the event Ian and Simone's marriage dissolved. She also asked me very directly whether I wanted Ian to know about this arrangement or not. I thought about that for a while. I said yes, Ian should know. I wasn't hiding anything from my son. I was protecting something for my granddaughter, and for him too, and I wanted him to understand that. I sat down with Ian for lunch in August, the month June turned 1. I told him what I'd done, not in a confrontational way. I told him the cabin would be his and his sister's to manage one day, but that ultimately it was being held for June. It would be hers. My father built it, my wife and I kept it, and now it would go to the next generation the way it was supposed to, whole, intact, without complication. Ian was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Dad, I never wanted to cause you stress over this. I said, I know that. He said, Simone is just, she worries. About security. About the future. I said, I understand. And the trust means June's future is secure. That's a real thing she can hold on to. He nodded. He ordered a second coffee. We talked about other things. I didn't know what conversation he had with Simone after that. I only know that she stopped raising the property with me entirely. Whether that was acceptance or strategy, I couldn't tell you. Life went on. June learned to walk. I visited when I could. Ian and I kept having our lunches. I spent 2 weeks at the cabin the following summer. The first time I'd been up there since Francis died. And I opened the windows and aired the whole place out. And I fixed the dartboards that had been loose since autumn. And one evening, I sat where Francis and I used to sit and watch the sun go down over the lake, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like myself. In February of 2024, Ian called me on a Tuesday evening. He sounded tired in the way that's different from work tired. He said he and Simone had been struggling. He said they'd been in couples counseling for a few months. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. I said, whatever you need from me, I'm here. He said he knew. By May, they had separated. Simone moved out. Ian stayed in the apartment with June, and they were working out a custody arrangement. Ian said Simone had been decent about June. That surprised him, and he said so. They were trying to do it without making things worse. I drove to Sudbury the weekend after Ian told me. I brought groceries. Nothing dramatic, just things I knew he'd actually use. a decent cut of meat, some things for June's lunches. I fixed a curtain rod that had come out of the wall. I sat with June while Ian slept in on Saturday morning for the first time in what looked like months. It was in July that I got the call from Margaret's office. Simone's lawyer had sent a letter. As part of the separation process, they were requesting disclosure of all family assets, which was standard. But there was a specific item, the cabin property outside Sudbury. The letter asked whether I had made any transfers or gifts related to the property in the past 5 years that might affect the matrimonial property calculation. Margaret called me herself. She said, "Ray, the trust is airtight." She said she'd seen this kind of inquiry before. Sometimes a lawyer sends it hoping something will turn up. She said my response would be simple, truthful, and complete. The property had never been transferred to Ian. It was held in trust for a minor beneficiary. It was not, and had never been, a matrimonial asset. She handled the correspondence. I didn't have to appear anywhere or sign anything beyond what Margaret prepared. But there was a meeting, Ian and Simone with their respective lawyers to go through the assets. I wasn't present, why would I be? But Ian called me that evening. He said it was fine. He said when the cabin came up and his lawyer explained the trust, Simone's lawyer had pushed back, asked when the trust was established, asked whether the timing was meant to hide assets. Margaret had anticipated this. She had the establishment date, more than a year before the separation, more than a year before anyone knew the marriage was in trouble, by any reasonable account. She had documentation of the original conversation between Ian and me about the property. She had everything in order. Ian said Simone's lawyer had gotten very quiet. Not screaming. This isn't a courtroom drama. Just quiet, in the way that lawyers get quiet when they realize the thing they were counting on isn't there. Simone had known about the trust. Ian had told her about it after our lunch, back when things were still okay between them. Maybe she thought it was vulnerable. Maybe her lawyer had told her it was worth challenging. I don't know what she'd been told. What I know is that the cabin stayed where it belonged. Ian got primary residence with June. Simone has her parenting time, and from what Ian says, she uses it well. I don't have any anger towards Simone truly. She wanted security and she went after it. Most people do. She just went after something that wasn't hers to take, and it wasn't there when she reached for it. Ruth came to visit last September. First time she'd been in Ontario in 3 years. We went up to the cabin, all of us. Ruth, her husband, their 2 kids, Ian, June. 6 people crowded into a cabin that sleeps 8 if you're not fussy about personal space. June is almost 3 now. She found a frog near the dock and carried it around for an hour until it got away from her. She cried for about 30 seconds and then found another one. I sat on the dock in the evening, same spot I always sit, and Ruth came out and sat beside me. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said Mom would have liked this. I said she would have been unbearable about being right. Ruth laughed. It's her mother's laugh. I'm glad it went somewhere. I'm 69 years old. I have 2 kids who talk to me. I have a granddaughter who calls me Grandpa Ray with great seriousness as if it's a formal title. I have a cabin that has been in my family for nearly 60 years and will be in it for 60 more, God willing. I didn't fight anyone. I didn't scheme. I just learned late the difference between being generous and being careless. And I got lucky enough to learn it before it cost me something I couldn't get back. That's the whole story. I got what I held on to. I paid attention. And in the end, that was enough. I keep thinking about the moment I almost said yes. Not because I was weak, because I was tired. And grief is something to your judgment that you don't fully understand until you're on the other side of it. Francis had been gone less than a year when Ian first asked me about the cabin. I wasn't thinking about property law or trust structures. I was thinking about how quiet the house had gotten and how much I wanted my son to be happy, and how easy it would have been to just let go of one more thing. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like this. It's not that the person being pressured is naive, it's that they're already carrying something heavy, and someone else is offering to take a little weight, except what they're actually taking is yours to give. Simone wasn't a villain. I want to say that plainly. She wanted security for her family, and there's nothing wrong with that instinct. What went wrong was the direction she aimed at. She looked at something that had been in my family for 60 years and saw an asset. I looked at it and saw my father's hands on those top boards. Those are 2 entirely different things, and no legal document was ever going to close that distance. What I learned from all of it, from Douglas, from Margaret, from Ruth's blunt phone call that October, is that good intentions on your part don't protect you from someone else's plans. I had spent my whole life trusting that doing the right thing was enough. Pay your taxes, keep your word, show up when people need you. That's enough, right? It's not. Always. Sometimes doing the right thing also means understanding what you're doing. There's a difference between being generous and being uninformed, and I had confused the two for a long time. Ruth knew. She didn't panic. She didn't accuse anyone of anything. She just said, get a proper lawyer, Dad, and understand your position before you make a decision. That's not suspicion. That's clear thinking. The kind of clear thinking I should have learned decades earlier. But sometimes you only learn the things you need when you actually need them. And Ian. Ian never wanted any of this to go the way it went. He was caught between his wife and his father, and he handled it the way a decent man handles an impossible position. He stayed honest with both of us, even when that cost him. That took something real. I don't take it lightly. June will be old enough to walk that property one day without holding anyone's hand. She didn't find frogs near the dock the way she did last September. She won't know for a long time what it took to make sure that place was still there for her. That's fine. That's how it should be. The work of one generation is often invisible to the next, and that's not a failure. That's the whole point. I'm 69 years old and I paid attention when it mattered. That's what I've got. It turns out that's plenty.